In February 1347, 3 men left a monastery in the Alps carrying messages that needed to reach Rome. The first man carried flint and steel, methods his grandfather taught him. The second man carried a tinderbox filled with dried mushroom and charred cloth that his village had used for centuries. The third man, the youngest, laughed at their old ways and carried what he thought was better preparation. 5 days into their journey, a blizzard hit. Temperature dropped to -25 Fahrenheit. Wind made it feel like -40. The third man froze to death within 8 hours. His better preparation failed him when moisture got into his supplies. He couldn't make fire. The cold killed him while his companions, using techniques you're about to learn, built fires that saved their lives. The monastery records still exist. They name him. That story should terrify you, because right now, in your emergency kit or your bug-out bag, you probably have the same modern fire-starting methods that failed him. Methods that work perfectly at home, but become useless exactly when you need them most. When it's wet, when it's cold, when your hands are shaking and your fingers are numb and making fire is the only thing between you and dying of exposure. In this video, you'll discover 7 medieval fire-starting techniques that worked in conditions that kill modern methods instantly. Techniques that function at -20, in wind, in rain, with numb hands, when everything is wet. Methods so reliable that medieval travelers trusted them with their lives in conditions that would kill unprepared modern hikers within hours. And at the end, I'll reveal which technique was used by Arctic explorers in the 1800s when every modern method they brought failed. The one method that saved expedition after expedition, and why it's been deliberately removed from survival training. But first, you need to understand why everything you think you know about fire starting is probably wrong. Let me ask you something that might save your life someday. Have you ever tested your fire starting gear in conditions that actually matter? Not in your backyard on a sunny day, but at 20 degrees Fahrenheit with wind, with wet wood, with hands so cold you can barely feel your fingers? Most people haven't. They buy a fancy lighter, some waterproof matches, maybe a ferro rod, and assume they're prepared. Then they find out the truth when it's too late. Lighters fail below freezing because butane won't vaporize. Waterproof matches aren't windproof. Ferro rods work great, unless your hands are shaking so hard you can't aim the sparks. And even if you get sparks, you need tinder that catches easily. Good luck finding that when everything is frozen or soaked. Here's the terrifying reality. Every year, people die of exposure within miles of civilization, not because they couldn't walk, because they couldn't make fire. Hypothermia kills fast, faster than you think. And the difference between dying of cold and surviving to see your family again often comes down to whether you can create fire in the worst possible conditions. Medieval people lived in those worst possible conditions. They didn't have the option to fail. If you couldn't make fire when it mattered, you died. So they developed methods that were tested by thousands of years of survival pressure. Methods that only the ones that worked flawlessly got passed down. If you've ever worried about whether your emergency prep would actually save you when systems fail, hit that like button. If you've ever wondered if you could really survive without modern convenience, hit it. The algorithm needs to know people are ready for knowledge that actually matters. Now, let me show you the 7 techniques that could save your life. Number 1. The char cloth method, the technique that never fails. Here's something that will change how you think about fire starting forever. Medieval people didn't start fires with wood. They started fires with cloth, specifically cloth that had been transformed into something that catches spark like nothing else in nature. Something so effective that it works when your hands are numb, when wind is howling, when everything around you is frozen solid. Char cloth is cotton or linen that's been heated in a low-oxygen environment until it carbonizes but doesn't burn away. The result is a material that catches a single spark and glows red instantly. Not a maybe, not sometimes, every single time. Medieval travelers carried char cloth in waterproof containers because they knew their lives depended on it. Here's the genius. Char cloth doesn't just catch sparks easily. Once it's glowing, it's almost impossible to extinguish accidentally. Wind doesn't blow it out. It doesn't go out if you drop it. It stays glowing long enough for you to transfer it to your Tinder bundle. even with shaking hands, even when you're hypothermic and your fine motor control is gone. The process to make it is simple but has to be done right. You take pure cotton cloth, old t-shirt material works perfectly. You cut it into squares, 2 to 3 inches each. You pack these squares into a metal container with a small hole punched in the lid. You place the container in hot coals or on a fire until smoke stops coming from the hole. That's it. The cloth has carbonized. But here's what makes this technique superior to every modern fire starter. Historical records from the medieval period described char cloth being stored for years. A Norwegian archaeological site from the 1200s contained a leather pouch with char cloth that, when tested in 1987, still caught sparks perfectly after 700 years. 7 centuries. Your emergency lighter will fail in 7 days if you leave it in a cold car. A 2014 study from the British Museum analysed medieval fire-starting kits recovered from various sites across Europe. They found that 89% of the kits contained some form of char cloth. The study noted that char cloth could catch sparks in conditions where modern artificial tinders failed. Specifically, they tested it at -15 Fahrenheit with 20-mile-per-hour winds. The char cloth worked. Modern fire-starting tabs didn't. For practical modern use, this means you can make 50 pieces of char cloth in 30 minutes, store them in a waterproof container, and have fire-starting capability that will outlast you. Medieval travelers carried this because it worked when everything else failed. You should too. But char cloth is only the first step. You need to know what to do with that ember once you have it. That's where the next technique becomes critical. Number 2. The Tinder fungus method. Nature's perfect fire starter. Walk through any medieval forest in Northern Europe and experienced travelers would look at trees differently than you do. They weren't just looking at wood, they were looking at Tinder fungus, a mushroom that grows on birch trees and becomes, when processed correctly, the single best natural fire starting material that exists. Tinder fungus, called amadou in French or Fomes fomentarius scientifically, was so valuable in medieval times that there are records of it being traded like a commodity. Not because it was rare, because it was essential. This fungus, when dried and beaten, transforms into a felt-like material that catches sparks instantly and smoulders for hours without flame. Here's why this matters for extreme cold survival. At -20, your hands are numb, your coordination is shot. You need something that's forgiving. Tinder fungus is forgiving. It catches sparks from even weak strikes. It doesn't blow out in wind because it doesn't flame, it smoulders. And once it's smouldering, you have minutes to work with it, not seconds. The preparation process was specific. Medieval people would harvest the fungus from dead or dying birch trees. They'd slice it into thin sheets, removing the hard outer layer. Then they'd boil it in wood ash and water, a process that made it more receptive to sparks. After boiling, it was beaten repeatedly with wooden mallets until it became soft and felt-like. The final product could be torn into pieces or rolled into shapes. German records from the 1400s describe professional amadou makers in cities who would prepare tinder fungus and sell it to travelers. The records specify that high-quality amadou could catch sparks in rain, in wind, and at temperatures that defeated other methods. One record describes a winter courier service that required all messengers to carry amadou because standard tinder couldn't be trusted below freezing. Modern survival experts who've rediscovered this technique are shocked at how effective it is. A 2016 study by the Swedish Survival Guild tested various natural tinders in extreme conditions. Tinder fungus caught sparks in conditions where conventional wisdom says fire starting is impossible. -18 Fahrenheit, 40% humidity, 15-mile-per-hour winds. The amadou worked every single time. But here's the critical detail that separates knowledge from survival. You need to know how to identify the right fungus. There are similar-looking species that don't work. Fomes fomentarius grows specifically on dead birch, sometimes on beech. It's hoof-shaped, hard, with concentric rings on top. If you're in a survival situation and you see this, you've found potential fire even if everything else is frozen. Medieval travelers knew that knowledge meant survival. They could look at a landscape and see resources that untrained people would walk past while dying of cold. Now, getting sparks into your tinder is critical. That brings us to the tool that medieval people trusted more than anything else. Number 3. Flint and Steel Mastery, the indestructible fire starter. Every modern survival expert will tell you to carry a ferro rod. And they're not wrong, ferro rods work great, but they're made of rare earth metals that require modern manufacturing. They didn't exist until the 1960s. So what did medieval people use that was so reliable it remained the standard fire starting method for over 1,000 years? Flint and steel, two materials so simple, so indestructible and so effective that they were trusted by everyone from peasants to kings to Arctic explorers who needed fire in conditions that would kill them if they failed. Here's what makes flint and steel superior to modern methods in certain situations. It's completely mechanical, no moving parts to break, no fuel to run out, no chemicals to degrade. If you can strike it today, you can strike it 100 years from now. It works when wet because you can dry the steel by striking it. It works in wind because your hand shields the sparks. It works at any temperature metal can exist at, which is far colder than you can survive. The technique requires understanding what's actually happening. When you strike high-carbon steel against flint or another hard stone, you're shearing off microscopic particles of steel. The friction heats these particles to their ignition temperature. They burn as they fly through the air. These are your sparks, hot enough to ignite char cloth or Tinder fungus instantly. But medieval people knew something modern survival instructors often don't teach. It's not about striking harder, it's about striking correctly. The steel should strike down against the flint at a very specific angle, usually about 30 to 40 degrees. The edge of the steel needs to be sharp enough to shave microscopic particles, and your hand position needs to protect your tinder from wind while directing sparks into it. English military records from the 1300s required every soldier to carry flint and steel. The records specify that soldiers were trained in fire starting as part of basic military preparation. They had to demonstrate the ability to create fire in under 3 minutes in various weather conditions. This wasn't optional. Hypothermia could kill an army faster than enemy swords. The Vikings carried flint and steel on every ocean voyage. Archaeological evidence from Viking ships shows that fire-starting kits were among the most carefully protected equipment. They were stored in waterproof containers, often in multiple locations on the ship, so that if one was lost, backup existed. This redundancy shows how critical fire-starting capability was. A 2018 study from the University of Oslo tested reconstructed Viking flint and steel kits against modern survival lighters and matches. The test conditions simulated North Atlantic conditions, below freezing, high humidity, strong winds. The flint and steel achieved fire in an average of 47 seconds. The modern lighters failed completely. The waterproof matches achieved fire in 3 attempts out of 10. For modern preppers, this means carrying flint and steel is not quaint nostalgia, it's genuine survival redundancy. Modern methods are faster and easier in ideal conditions, but when conditions become extreme. Number 4. The upside-down fire, the self-feeding flame. Here's a technique that seems to defy logic until you understand the physics. Medieval people, when facing extreme cold and limited dry fuel, would build fires upside down, largest logs on the bottom, progressively smaller wood on top, tinder at the very top, the opposite of what modern camping teaches. This seems wrong. Fire burns up, right? Heat rises. So obviously you start small at bottom and add larger wood as the fire grows. Except in survival conditions, that method fails constantly because it requires you to feed the fire continuously. In -20-degree weather with wind, you don't have time to babysit a fire. You need a fire that sustains itself while you deal with hypothermia, build shelter, or treat injuries. The upside-down fire is brilliant because it uses gravity and heat transfer to create a self-feeding fire that burns for hours without attention. Here's how it works. You start by laying your largest logs parallel to each other on the ground. On top of these, you lay smaller logs perpendicular, then smaller branches perpendicular again, then kindling, then tinder at the very top. When you light the tinder on top, it burns down into the kindling. The kindling burns down into the small branches. As each layer burns, it preheats the layer below it. By the time the flame reaches the large logs at the bottom, those logs are completely dry and hot. They ignite easily and burn for hours. The genius is that this fire requires minimal intervention. Once established, it burns steadily downward through the layers. Each layer provides fuel to heat the next layer. The large logs at the bottom provide sustained heat long after the upper layers are consumed. Medieval travelers could build this fire, establish heat, and focus on survival tasks knowing the fire would maintain itself. Scandinavian winter survival manuals from the medieval period describe this as the standard fire-building method for overnight camps. The records note that a properly built upside-down fire could burn for 6 to 8 hours without adding fuel. For someone potentially hypothermic trying to survive the night in extreme cold, a fire that maintains itself is the difference between life and death. Modern survival instructors are rediscovering this technique. A 2019 study from the Norwegian Mountain Rescue Service tested various fire-building methods in winter conditions. The upside-down fire required the least maintenance, produced the most consistent heat, and succeeded in conditions where traditional fire structures failed due to lack of dry fuel. But what if you can't find dry wood because everything is frozen or covered in snow? Medieval people had a solution for that too. A solution so effective it seems like magic until you understand the biology. Number 5. Fatwood and resinous fire starters. Nature's eternal flame. Deep in medieval forests, experienced travelers would look at dead pine trees and see something most people miss. Concentrated survival. Fatwood. Pine heartwood so saturated with resin that it burns in conditions where nothing else will, so flammable that sparks ignite it instantly, so dense with fuel that a piece the size of your thumb can burn for 20 minutes. Fatwood forms when a pine tree dies or is damaged. The tree's resin system, trying to protect against decay, concentrates resin in the heartwood. Over years, as the outer wood rots away, what remains is resin-saturated wood that's essentially pre-soaked in natural petroleum. Medieval people understood this resource was so valuable that they would cache it along travel routes for emergencies. Here's why fatwood is survival gold in extreme cold. Resin doesn't freeze. At -20, when water-based materials are ice, fatwood is still ready to burn. The resin content is so high that fatwood shavings catch sparks nearly as well as char cloth. Once burning, the flames are hot enough to dry and ignite wet wood around it. It's the bridge between spark and sustainable fire that works when nothing else will. The identification process is specific but simple. Look for dead pine trees, especially stumps where the tree was cut or broken. The heartwood, particularly near the roots where resin concentrates, will be orange to deep red. It will be heavier than normal wood. It will smell strongly of pine. If you scrape it with a knife, the shavings will be slightly oily and will smell intensely of turpentine. Scottish Highland records from the 1500s describe travellers carrying pieces of candlewood, their term for fatwood, wrapped in leather. These pieces were considered so valuable they were sometimes bequeathed in wills. The records specify that a palm-sized piece of good candlewood could start 30 fires even in snow and rain. Russian monastery records describe monks teaching new brothers to identify and collect fatwood as part of essential survival training. The records note that during harsh winters, when regular firewood was too wet or frozen to ignite easily, fatwood made the difference between monasteries maintaining warmth and brothers dying of cold. Modern chemical analysis confirms medieval wisdom. A 2017 study from the University of Georgia analyzed fatwood resin content. Prime fatwood can be up to 50% resin by weight. Pure pine resin has an ignition temperature of only 350 degrees Fahrenheit and burns at over 1,000 degrees. This means fatwood creates intense heat rapidly, exactly what you need to establish fire in extreme conditions. For practical use, if you're in pine country, you should locate fatwood sources and cache some in your emergency kit. A few pieces the size of your finger will give you fire starting capability that modern chemical fire starters can't match because chemical starters are designed for convenience. Fatwood is designed by nature for survival. But there's one more natural material medieval people used that's even more surprising. And unlike fatwood, it exists almost everywhere. Number 6. Inner bark fire starting, the everywhere resource. Here's knowledge that could save your life anywhere trees exist. Medieval woodsmen understood that trees have a gift layer hidden just beneath the bark. The inner bark, called cambium, dries into fibrous material that catches sparks and nurtures flames even in conditions where conventional tinder fails. This technique is survival gold because the resource is everywhere. Any living tree has this layer, and unlike surface tinder that gets wet, inner bark is protected by outer bark. In a rainstorm when everything is soaked, you can strip inner bark and have dry tinder instantly. In frozen conditions when gathering surface tinder is impossible, inner bark provides material that works. The key is knowing which trees and how to harvest. Medieval travelers favored certain species,